The first child to die had been drinking the milk for exactly 3 months. Nobody in Black Hollow questioned where Martha Whitmore got her milk. In a valley where fog clung to the hillsides like wet wool, and the nearest neighboring settlement lay 2 days' ride through treacherous marshland, asking too many questions felt like inviting trouble. The village of 43 souls had learned long ago that survival meant accepting certain mysteries, and Martha's milk was the sweetest mystery they'd ever tasted. She arrived every morning before dawn, her wooden cart creaking through the muddy streets, leaving clay jugs on doorsteps with the precision of clockwork. The milk was thick, almost cream-like, with a faintly sweet taste that mothers swore made their babies sleep through the night and their husbands work longer in the fields. It was unlike anything the dairy cows in the surrounding farms produced. Those animals gave thin, bluish milk that soured quickly in the humid valley air. Martha's milk stayed fresh for days, even in summer. The woman herself was an enigma wrapped in layers of grey wool and silence. She never spoke during her deliveries, never accepted payment directly, never looked anyone in the eye. Once a month, the village left a collection of goods outside the abandoned chapel at the edge of town: flour, salt, candles, needles. By morning, the items would be gone. It was an arrangement that had existed since before most current residents were born, inherited like the leaning houses and the perpetual dampness that rotted everything wooden within 5 years. Before continuing, check right now if already this inscribed on the channel, and tell me in the comments where is accompanying us. I want to see if there's someone from my city here. Thomas Bridger, the village's self-appointed record keeper and closest thing to an educated man, had tried once to trace Martha's origins. He'd searched through the few surviving documents from Black Hollow's founding in 1847, looking for any mention of the Whitmore family. What he found instead were pages torn from the town's original census, gaps in the birth records, and a disturbing pattern. Every generation seemed to have one woman who lived alone, who provided milk, who never married or bore children of her own. But Thomas had stopped his investigation abruptly after developing a persistent nosebleed that lasted 3 days. The doctor from the next county, summoned at great expense, could find no cause. The bleeding stopped the same day Thomas burned his research notes. He never spoke of Martha Whitmore again, though sometimes his wife caught him staring at their children as they drank their breakfast milk, a peculiar sadness darkening his features. The autumn of 1895 arrived with unusual violence. Rains that should have stopped in September continued into October, turning the roads into rivers of mud and isolating Black Hollow more completely than ever before. The mushrooms that usually carpeted the forest floor in modest profusion grew to grotesque sizes that defied normal biology, their caps as wide as dinner plates, their stems thick as children's arms, their gills underneath releasing spores in such quantities that the air sometimes shimmered with them like snow falling upward, coating everything with a fine white dust that made people cough and animals sneeze violently. Animals behaved strangely that season in ways that went beyond mere weather response. Crows gathered in unprecedented numbers, thousands upon thousands of them, darkening the skies at dawn and dusk, their calls echoing through the valley like some ancient language of clicks and caws that seemed almost structured, almost meaningful, as if they were discussing something important, reaching consensus on matters only they understood. They would gather in specific trees at specific times with such precision that it couldn't be coincidence, creating patterns in their arrangement that looked deliberate when viewed from high ground. Formations that suggested organization, purpose, intelligence beyond what anyone had seen in birds before. The few dairy cows that farmers still kept refused to graze near the western edge of town, where Martha's cottage supposedly stood somewhere in the mist-shrouded hills, bellowing with genuine terror when forced in that direction, their eyes rolling white with fear that seemed all too human. Horses would rear and bolt when led down certain paths they'd traveled peacefully for years. Dogs whimpered, and refused to enter sections of the forest they'd hunted in since puppyhood, sitting stubbornly at invisible boundaries and whining as if they could see something their masters couldn't. The rain itself seemed wrong that season, in ways that made old-timers uneasy. It fell in patterns that defied the usual mountain weather everyone had grown accustomed to, coming in waves that lasted exactly 3 hours before stopping for exactly 45 minutes, then resuming with mechanical precision, as if controlled by some vast clock. Lydia Marsh, who at 63 had lived in the valley her entire life and remembered stories her grandmother told of weather patterns going back another 60 years before that, remarked that in all that accumulated knowledge spanning more than a century, she'd never heard of weather behaving with such unnatural regularity, as if something or someone were controlling it, measuring it out in precise doses for purposes unknown. The water that collected in barrels and cisterns for household use had an unusual thickness to it, almost oily when poured, though it left no visible residue when evaporated in cooking pots. Lydia, who did fine dyeing work for families who could afford colored fabrics, had tried to use the collected rainwater for her craft and found that it changed colors in unexpected and disturbing ways. Her intended blue dye became a deep purple that looked almost black in certain lights. Red turned nearly black as dried blood. Yellow transformed into a green so vivid and unnatural that it hurt the eyes to look at directly and made people feel vaguely nauseous. Plants that normally thrived in wet autumn conditions withered instead, despite abundant moisture, their leaves developing black spots that spread like infection or disease. Patterns that looked almost like writing if you stared at them long enough, almost like someone or something was trying to communicate through the very vegetation. Several people reported seeing these patterns and feeling compelled to copy them, only to find that drawing the shapes made them feel deeply uncomfortable, filled with a sense of dread they couldn't explain or shake off for hours afterward. The general store, run by Henry Walsh and his wife Margaret for the past 15 years, became the unofficial gathering place for worried residents during those unsettling weeks. People would come in claiming they needed salt or flour or lamp oil, but really they wanted to share observations, to confirm that others were seeing the same disturbing changes in their familiar landscape, to feel less alone in their growing unease about what was happening to their valley. "My chickens won't lay anymore," complained Mrs. Patterson, a stern woman of 50 who prided herself on maintaining the most productive hen house in Black Hollow, her reputation built on consistently providing eggs to families throughout the year. "They just sit in their boxes all day and all night, staring at absolutely nothing with those bead eyes. And when I try to move them to force them out to exercise and eat properly, they make this sound, not normal clucking exactly, but something else entirely. Something that raises the hair on my arms, almost like they're trying to form words with their beaks. My husband thinks I'm going mad, losing my wits in my old age, but I swear to you, Margaret, I swear on my mother's grave, they're trying to speak human language." "Words? From chickens?" Henry Walsh raised an eyebrow skeptically, though his skepticism was tempered and undermined by his own disturbing observations. His 3 blue tick hounds, dogs that had tracked deer through these hills reliably for 5 years, had been acting peculiar too, refusing to enter certain parts of his property that they'd roamed freely before, whimpering when the wind came from the west carrying that faint, sweet metallic smell, howling at times when the moon wasn't even visible in the perpetually cloudy sky, as if responding to something he couldn't see or sense. "I know exactly how it sounds," Mrs. Patterson snapped, her weathered hands gripping her shopping basket until her knuckles went white with pressure. "But I've kept chickens for 30 years, since I was a girl of 20 working my father's farm before I married, and I know the difference between normal bird sounds and something else. I know every noise a chicken can make: contentment, distress, alarm, broodiness. These sounds are something else entirely. These are sounds that shouldn't come from a chicken's throat, sounds that require vocal anatomy they don't possess. Margaret Walsh, measuring out cornmeal with a tin scoop for another customer who'd been listening nervously to the conversation, paused in her work. "The crows," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it too loudly might somehow make it worse. "Has anyone else been noticing they're not eating anything? We've got a whole field of corn ready for harvest, nearly ripe, and normally by this time we'd be fighting off flocks of them every single day, losing half the crop to their thievery despite our best efforts with scarecrows and noise. This year, they just perch in the trees and watch. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. I tried to count once and gave up after 500. They just sit there watching everything we do." Henry went out yesterday morning to scare them off with his shotgun, fired both barrels right into the thickest part of the flock. They didn't scatter. They didn't fly away. They just turned their heads in perfect unison to look at him. All those black eyes, thousands of eyes, all looking at once directly at him. He came back inside, shaking so badly he could hardly hold his coffee cup. It was during this unseasonable wet period, with its strange rains and stranger animal behavior, that 7-year-old Emma Graves began having the dreams that would change everything. The first night was October 12th. Her mother, Sarah, would remember the exact date for the rest of her life, would mark it annually in her mind like some terrible anniversary, the day her daughter's innocence ended and a knowledge too dark for childhood began. Emma woke at precisely 3 in the morning, the hour when the human spirit is said to be weakest, and the boundary between sleep and waking grows dangerously thin, screaming with such intensity and such genuine terror that she ruptured blood vessels in her throat, leaving her voice hoarse and damaged for days afterward. Sarah and her husband Robert rushed to their daughter's bedside, their hearts pounding with parental panic, to find her sitting bolt upright in the bed they'd built for her with such love and care, her eyes open but unseeing, fixed on something only she could perceive, her small hands clawing at the linen sheets with such force that her fingernails had bent backward, leaving bloody crescents on the white fabric they'd washed and bleached so carefully just days before. "Emma, Emma, sweetheart, wake up!" Sarah shook her daughter gently at first, then more urgently, then almost frantically when the girl didn't respond, when those open eyes continued to stare at nothing or at something Sarah couldn't see and desperately didn't want to imagine. When Emma finally focused on her mother's face, when recognition returned to those young eyes that should have known nothing but love and safety, she spoke in a voice that seemed too old for her 7 years, too weighted with knowledge and sorrow no child should possess. "They're calling the names, over and over and over. Hundreds of names, thousands maybe. But the names are wrong when I try to say them. The sounds don't fit in my mouth properly. My tongue isn't shaped right to make them. My throat can't form the sounds they're showing me." "Who's calling names, honey?" Robert asked, his schoolteacher's instinct for precise language making him probe for details even through his fear. Lighting another lamp to drive back the darkness that seemed to press against the windows like something solid and malevolent, like something alive and hungry. "The people under the ground," Emma said matter-of-factly, as if this should be obvious to everyone, as if everyone could hear what she heard pulsing up through the earth itself. "They want us to know their names. But we don't have the right kind of tongue to say them properly. We don't have the right kind of throat. We don't have the right shape of mouth. The sounds require different anatomy than we have. They're trying to teach me, but it hurts my throat to make the shapes." Sarah and Robert exchanged worried glances over their daughter's head, their eyes meeting in that wordless communication parents develop, that ability to convey complex fears and questions in a single look. Emma had always been imaginative, prone to elaborate games and stories, inventing entire worlds during her solitary play in ways that had sometimes concerned them, but mostly delighted them. But this was different. This had a quality of certainty, of absolute conviction, that was deeply unsettling in a child so young. This wasn't a child playing pretend or seeking attention. This was a child reporting something she believed was absolutely, terrifyingly real. It was during this unseasonable wet period that 7-year-old Emma Graves began having the dreams. She would wake screaming about voices calling her name, not in English, but in sounds that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and resonate directly in her skull, vibrating in her bones. Her mother, Sarah, initially dismissed it as childhood nightmares, the product of too many ghost stories shared among the village children during their play. But Emma's descriptions were too consistent across multiple nights, too detailed for mere imagination. She drew pictures of symbols she couldn't possibly have seen anywhere in the village, geometric patterns that made Sarah's eyes hurt to look at, that seemed to shift and move when viewed from different angles. The girl's fingers moved as if possessed when she drew, creating spirals within spirals, dots arranged in configurations that seemed almost mathematical, lines intersecting at angles that suggested complex calculations beyond a child's understanding. "They want to tell me something," Emma insisted, her small face pale in the lamplight. "They want me to remember." "Remember what, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, stroking her daughter's sweat-dampened hair. "I don't know. Something about the ground. Something buried." Within a week, 3 other children reported similar dreams. Then 5. Then every child in the village under the age of 12 was waking with the same haunted look, describing voices that spoke in a language of clicks and drawn-out vowels, sounds that seemed to originate from beneath the earth itself. The adult symptoms were different but no less disturbing in their implications and effects. Jonathan Pierce, the blacksmith whose powerful arms had shaped metal for the village for 15 years, was the first among the adults to notice the pain. It started on October 15th, a date he would remember because it was the day he was shoeing Reverend Marcus's horse, a temperamental mare that required all his attention. He was carefully filing the hoof, bent over with his full concentration on the delicate work, when he felt something strange in his left femur. Not quite pain initially, but a sensation of pressure, as if the bone were expanding against his flesh from the inside, trying to burst through skin and muscle like a plant breaking through soil. "Just getting old," he told his wife Clara that evening as they sat by their fireplace, the autumn cold seeping through the gaps in their cabin walls despite the fire's warmth. He rubbed his thigh, trying to massage away the discomfort. 38 isn't young anymore, not in this climate. The damp gets into your bones after a while, settles in and never leaves. My father used to complain about the same thing. But by the next morning, the sensation had spread to his right leg in exactly the same location, identical pressure in the same spot on the bone, as if following some blueprint, some pattern that demanded symmetry. By that evening, both arms felt the same peculiar pushing from within, a sense that his skeleton was trying to reconfigure itself to take on some new shape that his flesh couldn't accommodate. It wasn't constant. It came in waves, pulsing in a rhythm that he couldn't quite identify, but that felt oddly familiar, like a half-remembered song from childhood, like a heartbeat that wasn't quite his own, but belonged to someone or something else entirely. "It's like something's trying to grow inside my bones," he confided to Thomas Bridger 3 days later, when the pain had become impossible to ignore or dismiss as mere aging aches. He'd sought out Thomas specifically because the man was educated, had read medical books, might understand what was happening in terms beyond frontier superstition. "Like there's information encoded deep in my skeleton. Information that's trying to express itself, trying to take physical form. I can almost feel it, shapes and patterns pressing outward, wanting to be real." Within 3 days of Jonathan's first symptoms, a dozen adults reported similar experiences, comparing notes in worried conversations at the general store and after church services. The pain would migrate through their skeletons, seemingly at random but with an underlying pattern if you paid attention. Pelvis 1 hour, ribs the next, making breathing uncomfortable, then jaw, where the teeth rooted, making eating painful, then spine with that horrible sensation of vertebrae trying to reconfigure themselves into some other arrangement. Some described it as their bones trying to grow new structures, to add protrusions or change angles. Others said it felt like something trying to communicate through their skeletal system, using pressure and pain like Morse code that had recently been demonstrated in the county seat, dots and dashes of agony that spelled out messages in a language the conscious mind couldn't read, but the body understood perfectly at some deep cellular level. Dr. William Harrison, who visited Black Hollow once monthly from the county seat on a predetermined schedule to check on the general health of this isolated community, happened to be in town when the symptoms peaked in the 3rd week of October. He examined 6 patients in one afternoon and early evening in the back room of the general store, where people could have some privacy for medical examinations, and found himself completely baffled despite 2 decades of medical practice that had exposed him to frontier diseases and injuries of every type. There was no swelling he could detect with even his most careful palpation, no inflammation visible or tactile, no fever when he checked temperatures, no redness or heat in the affected areas, no visible cause whatsoever for the pain they described with such consistency and conviction. Their bones appeared normal to percussion. He tapped along their limbs and spine, listening for the hollow sounds that would indicate problems, and heard only healthy resonance. Their joints moved freely through full range of motion without the grinding or catching that would suggest arthritis or injury. Yet all of them winced and gasped when he manipulated certain areas with even gentle pressure, as if touching them triggered deep internal agony that had no physical source he could identify with any of his diagnostic tools or years of experience. "I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of medical practice," he admitted to Thomas Bridger, wiping his hands on a cloth and shaking his head with the frustrated bewilderment of a professional facing something beyond his training. "I've treated broken bones and infections, arthritis and joint diseases, cancers that eat away at bone tissue. But this is different from all of those. It's as if their bones are reporting pain independent of any tissue damage, any disease process I can recognize. Neurologically, according to everything I learned in medical school, that shouldn't even be possible. Bones don't have pain receptors the way soft tissue does. They can hurt when fractured, certainly, or when the periosteum, the outer covering that supplies the bones with blood and nerves, is damaged or inflamed. But this is different. This is pain originating from inside the bone structure itself, from the core of the skeleton. It defies every anatomical principle I understand. Yet they're all experiencing the same impossible thing," Thomas observed, making careful notes in his journal with his characteristic attention to detail, documenting every word the doctor said, which suggests either mass hysteria, which seems unlikely given the specificity and consistency of symptoms across different ages and temperaments, or exposure to some toxin or substance that affects nerve function in ways medical science doesn't yet understand. Some substance that could cross the blood-bone barrier and alter perception of skeletal integrity, change how the bones communicate with the nervous system. The smell came last in the progression of symptoms, and it was perhaps the most disturbing symptom of all, the one that finally convinced even the skeptics that something terribly wrong was happening in Black Hollow. Martha Fletcher, a seamstress of 42, who lived alone in a small but tidy cottage near the eastern edge of the village and made her living doing detailed needlework for the few families who could afford such luxury, was the first to notice it. She woke one morning in late October, the exact date lost in the horror of memory, convinced that something had died in her walls. A rat perhaps, or a squirrel or possum that had gotten trapped in the narrow space between the inner boards and outer weatherproofing while seeking shelter from the rain, suffocating there in the dark. The smell was that of old metal and something organic beginning its inevitable decay, sweet and metallic simultaneously in a combination that made her stomach turn like copper pennies left to soak in spoiled milk until both substances corrupted each other. She searched every corner of her small house with increasing desperation and growing panic, pulling furniture away from walls with strength born of revulsion, checking beneath the floorboards with a lamp held close, examining the rafters overhead until her neck ached from looking up. Nothing. No dead animal she could find, no rotting food forgotten in some corner during a distracted moment, no source for the smell she could identify despite hours of searching. It wasn't until her neighbor, Mrs. Eliza Grant, stopped by to borrow thread and ask if Martha had seen her cat, that the horrifying truth revealed itself. "Good Lord, what's that smell?" Eliza had asked immediately upon entering, before even completing her greeting, wrinkling her nose and bringing her handkerchief up to cover her face instinctively. "I don't know," Martha admitted, her voice breaking slightly with frustrated tears after hours of fruitless searching. "I've been trying to find the source all morning. I thought something died in my walls, but I can't locate it anywhere." Eliza sniffed cautiously, following the scent around the room like a hound tracking prey, checking corners and furniture, until finally she stepped close to Martha to move past her toward the kitchen and sniffed again involuntarily. Her face went pale as flour, all color draining away in an instant. "Oh, Martha," she whispered, her voice full of horrified pity. The smell is coming from you, from your body." "That's impossible," Martha said automatically. But even as the words left her mouth, she raised her own arm and smelled her own skin, bringing her wrist close to her nose. Eliza was right. The scent wasn't in the house at all. It was emanating from Martha's own body, from her pores, from her breath when she exhaled, from her hair when she moved her head. She was the source of the corruption she'd been searching for so desperately. Lydia Marsh, who at 63 was the village's eldest resident, was the first to make the connection. "It's the milk," she announced at the community gathering called to discuss the spreading affliction. Her voice cut through the anxious murmuring like a knife. "Has to be. It's the only thing we all consume, the only thing that comes from outside our own production." The suggestion was met with immediate resistance. The milk was their lifeline, had been for generations. It was unthinkable that it could be the source of their suffering. Children had been raised on it. The elderly claimed it extended their lives. Families had named Martha Whitmore in their evening prayers, thanking God for the providence she represented. But Lydia pressed her point. When did these symptoms start? October. When do we consume the most milk? In the cold months, when our own animals produce less. And has anyone noticed? The animals won't touch it. This last observation sent a chill through the assembly. It was true. Dogs turned away from bowls of milk. Cats, usually desperate for cream, hissed and retreated when it was offered. The few chickens that had accidentally pecked at spilled milk had died within hours, their crops distended and blackened. Thomas Bridger stood slowly, his face grave. "I propose an experiment. For 1 week, we stop consuming the milk. We'll pool our resources, use what little our own animals produce, ration it carefully. If the symptoms diminish, we'll know Lydia is right." The vote was nearly unanimous, though several mothers wept openly at the thought of depriving their children of what they'd been told was essential nourishment. That night, every household in Black Hollow poured their remaining milk into the ground, watching as the white liquid disappeared into the dark earth with an unsettling eagerness, as if the soil itself was thirsty for it. The next morning, Martha Whitmore's cart did not appear. The absence of the milk delivery sent a wave of unease through Black Hollow that was almost palpable. For 48 years, according to Thomas's revised research, the milk had arrived with mechanical regularity. Even during the terrible winter of 1873, when snow had buried the village for 3 weeks, someone had found jugs waiting on doorsteps each morning, the milk miraculously unfrozen despite temperatures that killed livestock and cracked wagon wheels. Now, the doorsteps were bare. The children's dreams intensified in those first days without milk. Emma Graves began speaking in her sleep, her voice taking on inflections and rhythms that sounded ancient, inhuman. Her mother, staying awake to watch over her, swore she saw her daughter's lips move in patterns that couldn't form English words, her small throat working to produce sounds that seemed to require different vocal anatomy altogether. But something else was happening too. The bone pain that had plagued the adults began to change quality. Instead of the constant pressure, it became intermittent, pulsing in rhythm with something the sufferers couldn't identify. Several people, including Jonathan the blacksmith, reported feeling as though their skeletons were trying to communicate, sending signals through pain that almost resembled patterns. "It's like Morse code," Jonathan said, though he'd only heard of such a thing from a traveling salesman years ago. "Dots and dashes, but in my bones." On the third day without milk, Thomas Bridger made a decision that would change everything. He would find Martha Whitmore's cottage and demand answers. He set out before dawn, taking with him a hunting rifle, a compass, and determination born of desperation. The western edge of Black Hollow, where tradition placed Martha's home, was a landscape of contradictions. The ground there was boggy, treacherous, yet dotted with hillocks that rose abruptly from the marshland like the humped backs of buried giants. Pine trees grew in twisted configurations, their trunks corkscrewing as if they'd grown while trying to escape something beneath the earth. Thomas had walked these woods before, in his youth, and remembered them as merely unpleasant. Now they felt hostile. The fog was thicker here, moving against the wind, forming shapes that dispersed just as his mind began to recognize them. Twice he thought he heard voices, not words but sounds, organized like language, rising from the ground itself. He found the cottage by accident, nearly walking past it twice before his eyes adjusted to see it. It wasn't hidden, exactly, but it seemed to exist in a pocket of space his mind wanted to skip over, like the blind spot in human vision. Once he focused on it, the structure became clear. A small stone building, ancient by the valley's standards, with walls that looked older than the settlement of Black Hollow itself. The door was ajar. Inside, Thomas found a single room that served as living space, kitchen and workshop. But it wasn't the humble cottage he'd expected. The walls were covered with markings, symbols carved into the stone that matched exactly what Emma Graves had been drawing in her sleep. The floor was bare earth, but it had been excavated in places, revealing layers of different-colored soil arranged in what looked like deliberate stratification. And there were bones, not animal bones, though Thomas's first hopeful thought tried to convince him they were. These were human remains, arranged in patterns on crude shelves, sorted by type. Femurs with femurs, ribs with ribs, skulls lined up like books. They were old, far older than any grave in Black Hollow's cemetery, their surfaces darkened and etched with the same symbols that covered the walls. But there was no sign of Martha Whitmore, no sign of cows or goats or any animal that might produce milk. No dairy equipment, no churns, no cooling containers. In the center of the room sat a large ceramic vessel, its surface glazed and decorated with more of the mysterious symbols. Thomas approached it slowly, his heart hammering. The vessel was filled with liquid, milk, or something that looked like milk. But when he leaned closer, the smell that rose from it was wrong. It was sweet, yes, but underneath that sweetness was something else, something that reminded him of the metallic scent that had begun emanating from the villager's skin. He was about to dip a finger in when he noticed the floor beneath the vessel. The bare earth there was different from the surrounding soil. It was darker, richer, and when he knelt to examine it more closely, he saw why. The soil was mixed with bone dust. Finely ground human remains, worked into the earth in quantities that suggested decades, perhaps centuries, of gradual incorporation. And from this enriched soil, barely visible against the dark background, were what looked like root structures. But they didn't belong to any plant. They were white, almost translucent, and they pulsed faintly, like veins carrying blood. Thomas stumbled backward, his mind reeling. The vessel, he now understood, wasn't a storage container. It was collecting what grew from that soil, what those root-like structures produced. The milk wasn't milk at all. It was something else entirely, something that grew from ground, enriched with the dead. He ran from the cottage, his rifle forgotten, his compass abandoned. He ran through the twisted pines and treacherous bogs, fell twice in the sucking mud, and didn't stop until he reached the edge of Black Hollow proper. There he collapsed, gasping, and when he could finally speak, he managed only 4 words before passing out. "We drank the dead." When Thomas Bridger regained consciousness, he found himself surrounded by the entire village. Word of his collapse had spread quickly, and the residents of Black Hollow had gathered with the desperate hope that he'd brought answers. What he told them instead was a nightmare that transformed their understanding of everything they thought they knew. The village meeting hall, a repurposed barn that smelled of old hay and lamp oil, filled with voices raised in disbelief and horror. But beneath the shock ran a deeper current: recognition. As Thomas described what he'd found, people began remembering fragments of stories their grandparents had told, pieces of Black Hollow's history that had been dismissed as legend. Lydia Marsh stood again, her elderly frame seeming to solidify with the weight of memory. "My grandmother told me things before she died," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. Things about why this valley was empty when the founders arrived in 1847. Things about what happened here before. The room fell silent. "There were people here before us," Lydia continued. "Native peoples who'd lived in this valley for generations beyond counting. When the first white settlers came through in the early 1800s, they found a thriving community. Small, isolated but thriving. These people had ceremonies, sacred grounds, ways of honoring their dead that the settlers didn't understand." She paused, her eyes distant. "The settlers wanted the land. The valley was fertile, the water was good, and they didn't believe a handful of savages had any right to it. So they did what settlers did in those days. They attacked in winter, when the snow made escape impossible. They killed everyone, men, women, children, and then they did something worse." Thomas felt ice forming in his stomach. "The burial grounds." Lydia nodded. "The native peoples here practiced excarnation, leaving their dead exposed until the flesh was gone, then burying the bones in sacred ossuaries. The settlers found these bone repositories and saw them as proof of barbarism. They scattered the bones, used the cleared ground to build the first structures of what would become Black Hollow. They built over the graves quite deliberately, thinking it would erase what came before. But some of those bones weren't scattered," Thomas said, pieces falling into place. "Someone gathered them, preserved them. A woman," Lydia confirmed. "The settlers' documents mention her only in passing. A widow who went mad with grief after her husband was killed in the massacre. While the other settlers celebrated their conquest, she began collecting the scattered bones. She felt it was wrong, what they'd done. Unholy. She tried to make amends in the only way she knew how." Sarah Graves, Emma's mother, stood abruptly. "What do you mean, make amends? What did she do?" It was Thomas who answered, the horrifying logic of it crystallizing in his mind. "She created a guardian, or thought she did. She collected the bones, marked them with what she thought were protective symbols, and buried them in a place she declared sacred, that cottage, or what stood there before. She convinced herself that by honoring the dead in some fashion, she could prevent retribution. But the bones aren't just bones anymore," Jonathan said slowly, touching his aching ribs. "Are they?" Thomas shook his head. "The soil there has been enriched with bone ash for generations, and something grows in it. Not a plant exactly, but a fungal network. I saw the structures, white, branching, drawing nutrients from the calcified remains, creating a substance that mimics milk in appearance but carries within it microscopic fragments of bone, compounds extracted from the remains through a process I don't fully understand." The implications settled over the room like a shroud. "We've been drinking them," Sarah whispered, "drinking the ground bones of the murdered. Now I want to address something important. If you're finding this story compelling, if it's making you think about the weight of history and the consequences of forgotten violence, then I need your help. Creating these detailed narratives takes tremendous time and research. Leave a like if this story is resonating with you, and subscribe if you want to see more content that explores the dark corners of human history. Your support literally determines whether I can continue producing these stories. Emma Graves, who had been sitting quietly beside her mother, suddenly spoke. Her voice was calm, clearer than it had been in weeks. "They're not trying to hurt us," she said. "The voices in my dreams, they're not angry. They're trying to tell us what happened. They're trying to be remembered." "What?" Sarah pulled her daughter close, protective and confused. "The pain we feel," Emma continued, gesturing to the adults. "It's not punishment. It's memory. The bones we consumed, they carry information, chemical traces of trauma, of violent death. Our bodies are responding to that information. The dreams, the pain, the smells, they're all our nervous systems trying to process a history we ingested without knowing." Thomas stared at the child, stunned. "How do you—" "Because I listen," Emma said simply. "The voices aren't supernatural. They're neurological. The compounds in the milk, they've been affecting our brains, our nervous systems. Creating false memories, or maybe unlocking genetic memories. I don't know. But they're not ghosts. They're chemistry." An uncomfortable silence filled the hall as people processed this. The explanation was somehow more disturbing than ghosts would have been. Ghosts could be exorcised, blessed away, ignored. But chemistry, biology, the physical residue of atrocity carried through generations and consumed unknowingly, that was inescapable. "Martha Whitmore," Lydia said quietly. "Where does she fit in this?" "She's the latest guardian," Thomas said. "The role passes down, probably through women who feel some ancestral guilt, some need to maintain this terrible vigil. She tends the bones, collects the milk-like substance that grows from them and distributes it. Whether she knows exactly what she's doing, I can't say. The role might have been passed down with such distortion over the generations that she believes she's performing some sacred duty." "We need to find her," Jonathan declared. "We need answers. We need this to stop." But even as he spoke, the first scream came from outside. The fire started in 3 places simultaneously. At the cottage Thomas had discovered, at the old chapel where offerings were left for Martha, and at the community well that had served Black Hollow since its founding. By the time the villagers rushed from their meeting, flames were already climbing into the fog-shrouded sky, turning the perpetual grey to flickering orange. But these weren't normal fires. The flames burned wrong, too white, too cold-looking despite their heat, and the smoke that rose from them was thick and black, with a smell that made people's eyes water and throats close. It was the smell of burning bone, of rendering fat, of organic material that shouldn't burn, but was consumed anyway. Martha Whitmore stood at the center of the village, finally visible to all, finally still. She was younger than anyone had imagined, perhaps 30, perhaps 40, age rendered uncertain by malnutrition and the kind of exhaustion that settles into a person's very bones. Her grey dress hung on a frame so thin it seemed impossible she'd had the strength to push her cart through the muddy streets all these years. But her eyes were what held everyone's attention. They were filled with a desperate resolve that bordered on madness. "You weren't supposed to stop drinking," she said, her voice cracking from disuse. These were the first words anyone in living memory had heard her speak. "You were supposed to continue. You were supposed to remember." Thomas stepped forward carefully, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Remember what, Martha? What are you trying to make us remember? What your grandfathers did. What they built this town on. The screaming in the snow. The children's bodies thrown into the ravine. The elders beaten to death with their own ceremonial staffs." Her voice grew stronger, more terrible. "My great-great-grandmother was one of them, the settlers, the murderers. She married a man who bragged about how many he'd killed. And when she finally understood what she'd become complicit in, she dedicated her remaining years to ensuring the dead wouldn't be forgotten. By poisoning us, Sarah Graves demanded, her arm around Emma. Not poisoning, teaching. Martha's laugh was brittle, hollow. The milk was supposed to carry their memory forward, each generation consuming the essence of those who were slaughtered here, ensuring their stories became part of Black Hollow's story. My family has tended those bones for 150 years, cultivating the mycelial network that transforms their calcium and marrow into something consumable, ensuring that you, that all of us, never forget the price of this land. But we didn't know, someone shouted from the crowd. We're not responsible for what our ancestors did. Martha's expression hardened. Aren't you? You live in houses built over their graves. You farm fields watered by the stream where their blood flowed. You benefit every day from an atrocity you've conveniently forgotten. The milk was supposed to make forgetting impossible. Jonathan the blacksmith moved forward, his large hands clenched. And the pain, the dreams, the way our children scream in the night. That's your idea of education? That's memory, Martha said quietly. Real memory. The kind that lives in your bones, in your nerves, in the deepest parts of your brain. The kind you can't dismiss or romanticize or turn into a comfortable story. You wanted to know why the symptoms started this year, why they're worse now. Because after 150 years, the concentration has reached critical mass. The mycelial network beneath this town has spread to every structure, every foundation. You're not just drinking the dead anymore. You're living on top of them, breathing them in, absorbing them through every pore. The fires continued to burn around them, and Thomas suddenly understood. You're destroying the evidence, the bones, the cottage, the well. You're trying to end it. I'm releasing them, Martha corrected. When bone burns, the calcium compounds break down and disperse. The dead have done their work. They've made themselves known. Now they can finally rest. And so can I. You planned this, Lydia said, her old eyes sharp. You waited until the symptoms were undeniable, until we'd stopped drinking, until we'd investigated. You wanted us to know the truth before you burned it all. Martha nodded slowly. Every guardian is given a choice. Continue the vigil indefinitely, or judge when the lesson has been sufficiently taught and end the cycle. I chose to end it, because I looked into your children's eyes and saw what you couldn't. They already understand. They already know that human bones rest beneath their feet, that violence echoes through generations, that forgetting isn't the same as absolution. Emma pulled away from her mother and walked toward Martha. The adults tensed, but the girl moved with calm purpose. She stopped a few feet from the thin woman and said, I forgive you, for what that's worth. You can't forgive me, Martha said softly. I'm not the one who needs forgiveness. Then who does? Emma asked. Martha smiled sadly and gestured at the burning buildings, at the village itself, at the fog-shrouded hills that had witnessed so much suffering. All of us. None of us. Forgiveness might not even be the right word. Acknowledgement, maybe. Remembrance. The willingness to say, this happened here, on ground we now claim as ours, and we carry that history whether we want to or not. The fires burned through the night. By morning the cottage was gone, reduced to a circle of scorched earth. The chapel had collapsed, its wooden frame unable to withstand the intense heat. The well had been filled in with the burning debris, sealed forever. Martha Whitmore disappeared that night, slipping away while the village watched the flames. Some claimed they saw her walking toward the eastern hills, where the ravine still bore the bones of those thrown there 150 years ago. Others insisted she walked into the fire itself, choosing to join those she'd spent her life memorializing. No one ever saw her again. The symptoms didn't disappear overnight. The bone pain persisted for weeks in the adults, gradually diminishing, but never fully vanishing. The children's dreams became less frequent, but continued sporadically, as if their young nervous systems were slowly processing and filing away the information that had been chemically introduced. But something had fundamentally changed in Black Hollow. Thomas Bridger, with the help of several volunteers, began the grim work of proper documentation. They excavated where the cottage had stood and found layers upon layers of human remains, not just from the massacre, but from burial sites that predated it by centuries. These were the bones Martha's ancestor had gathered, preserved, and cultivated into her terrible garden of remembrance. Working with Emma Graves, whose strange clarity of understanding proved invaluable, Thomas developed a theory about what had actually happened. The milk was indeed the product of a vast mycelial network, a fungal colony that had been deliberately cultivated to break down bone material. Mycologists had long known that certain fungi could decompose even the hardest organic materials, and that they could transport nutrients and even information through their networks. What Martha's ancestor had created, likely by accident more than design, was a system that extracted compounds from ancient human remains and made them bioavailable. When consumed regularly over generations, these compounds had multiple effects. Calcium deposits that triggered bone pain, alkaloids that affected dream states, and pheromone-like substances that produced the metallic smell villagers had reported. But the most profound effect was neurological. Recent studies, which Thomas learned about from a visiting naturalist months later, had begun to show that trauma could leave chemical markers in bone tissue, and that these markers could theoretically be transferred and even interpreted by other human nervous systems. It was cutting-edge science, barely understood, but it suggested that Martha hadn't been entirely wrong. The milk had carried memory, though through chemistry rather than magic. "It's terrifying when you think about it," the naturalist said, examining Thomas's careful notes. "The idea that we could literally consume the history of violence, that it could become part of our own biology. It makes every atrocity permanent in a way we'd never considered." The village held a memorial service 3 months after the fire. They erected a stone marker at the site where Martha's cottage had stood, though they debated fiercely about what it should say. Some wanted to name the dead, though they had no names to give. Others wanted to acknowledge the massacre directly. In the end, they settled on words that Emma had suggested. "Here rest those who came before. Their bones fed this ground. Their story feeds us still. May we never forget the price of home." It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough, but it was honest. The village itself began to change. Families left, unable to stomach living on land they now knew was saturated with the residue of mass murder. Others stayed but changed their practices. Several families began researching what little they could find about the native peoples who'd inhabited the valley, trying to piece together fragments of a culture their ancestors had worked so hard to erase. Sarah Graves started a school where children learned not just reading and arithmetic, but also the true history of Black Hollow. Emma helped teach the youngest ones, her experience with the dreams making her uniquely qualified to help other children process difficult truths. "Do the dreams still scare you?" one 6-year-old asked her. "Sometimes," Emma admitted, "but I understand them better now. They're not monsters. They're just people who died badly and weren't remembered properly. The dreams are my mind's way of giving them a kind of funeral." Jonathan, the blacksmith, melted down tools and equipment to create a series of wind chimes, which he hung throughout the village. The metal came from the same iron deposits that the original settlers had mined, the same materials that had been forged into weapons for the massacre. Now they sang in the wind, a perpetual reminder and a kind of transformation. Lydia Marsh lived another 2 years before dying peacefully in her sleep. Her last words to Thomas were, "Make sure they keep remembering. Not with guilt. Guilt is useless. But with clarity. Clear eyes see true history, and only true history can inform a better future." The mycelial network beneath Black Hollow gradually died without Martha's cultivation. Soil samples taken a year after the burning showed the fungal structures breaking down, returning to normal microbial activity. The bones remained, of course. They would remain for millennia, mixing slowly with the earth, becoming geography. But the village's relationship with that geography had fundamentally changed. 5 years after the burning, a delegation from a neighboring indigenous community made contact with Black Hollow. Word had spread about the memorial, about the village's attempts to reckon with its past. The delegation was cautious, rightfully suspicious, but willing to talk. "Our people have stories about this place," one elder said, standing near the memorial stone. "About relatives who disappeared into this valley and never returned. We'd heard rumors, but we assumed everyone had died. We didn't know anyone was trying to remember. We're not doing a very good job of it," Thomas admitted. "We don't even know their names. Names can be researched. Some of us keep genealogies going back generations. If you're serious about remembrance, we could help." It was the beginning of a long, difficult process. Names were added to the memorial, 14 in the first year, as oral histories and written records were carefully compared. Each name represented a person, a life, a loss that Black Hollow had built itself upon. The village also returned something, a portion of the bones that had been preserved. They were reburied according to the proper ceremonies of the peoples they'd belonged to, in ground that the delegation designated as sacred. Black Hollow deeded that land to the tribal community in perpetuity, a small patch of the valley returning to its rightful stewards. "It doesn't fix what happened," one of the tribal representatives said at the reburial ceremony. "Nothing can fix it. But acknowledgement is something. Remembrance is something. It's more than most places offer." Thomas Bridger continued his documentation work until his death in 1912. His records, meticulous and unflinching, became a resource for historians studying the settlement period and its violence. But more than that, they became a model for honest reckoning, a demonstration that communities could face their darkest truths and emerge, if not redeemed, then at least informed. Emma Graves grew up to become a teacher, then a scholar, eventually leaving Black Hollow to study chemistry and neurobiology at a university back east. She published papers on the transfer of information through organic compounds, work that was decades ahead of its time. She never forgot the dreams and used them as a starting point for research that would eventually contribute to the emerging field of epigenetics, the study of how experiences, including trauma, can leave biological markers that transfer between generations. In a letter to her mother in 1908, she wrote, "I used to think the milk was poison, that Martha was a monster for what she did to us. But I understand now that she was working with the only tools she had: biology, chemistry, the stubborn persistence of memory in physical form. She was trying to solve an impossible problem. How do you make people care about atrocities they didn't witness? How do you prevent forgetting when forgetting is so much more comfortable than remembering?" Her solution was horrifying, yes, but it was also brilliant in its terrible way. We literally consumed history, made it part of our bodies, and in doing so, made forgetting impossible. The Valley of Black Hollow exists to this day, though the village itself has largely been abandoned. A few descendants still live in the surrounding area, tending the memorial and hosting an annual ceremony of remembrance. The land where the cottage stood remains bare. Nothing grows there, though soil tests show no chemical reason why it shouldn't. Some things, it seems, resist easy explanation even when the rational processes behind them are understood. Visitors sometimes report a faint, sweet smell in the air near the memorial, though chemical analysis shows nothing unusual. Children who picnic near the site sometimes have vivid dreams that night, though whether this is suggestion, coincidence, or something else remains debated. What isn't debated is the lesson. Black Hollow stands as a reminder that history isn't abstract. It's physical, material, something we build upon and often consume without knowing. The story of Martha Whitmore and her terrible milk isn't about ghosts or curses. It's about the ways violence persists, how it seeps into soil and water and food, how it can quite literally become part of us. The bones beneath our feet remember. The ground remembers. And whether we acknowledge it or not, we carry that memory in ways we're only beginning to understand. The milk of Black Hollow was never about vengeance in any supernatural sense. It was about the stubborn insistence of truth, the biological persistence of trauma, and the chemical reality that nothing is ever truly buried. What we sow in blood, we reap in bone. What we build on suffering becomes part of our foundation, and what we consume, even unknowingly, becomes part of who we are. That's the real horror of Black Hollow. Not ghosts whispering from beyond the grave, but the scientific fact that the dead persist in ways we can measure, analyze, and accidentally ingest. Chemistry doesn't need curses to be terrifying. Biology doesn't need spirits to haunt us. Sometimes the most frightening truths are the ones that have rational explanations. The memorial stone still stands, weathered now by decades of valley fog and rain. Moss grows in the letters of the names carved there, names that were forgotten, then remembered, then honored. And if you visit on a quiet morning, when the mist clings low to the ground and the wind chimes sing their metallic song, you might understand what Martha Whitmore spent her life trying to teach. Some debts aren't paid with apologies or monuments. Some debts become part of the land itself, part of the water and soil and even the air. We inherit them whether we want to or not, whether we acknowledge them or not. The choice isn't whether to carry history. The choice is only whether to do so consciously. Black Hollow made its choice. The milk stopped flowing, but the memory remains, not as a curse, but as a responsibility. And in a world increasingly comfortable with forgetting, that might be the most important legacy of all. The children of Black Hollow's children don't have the dreams anymore. The compounds have long since cleared from their bloodlines. But they know the stories, learn them in school, visit the memorial, and understand in a way their great-great-grandparents never did. The ground beneath them isn't neutral. It's saturated with history. And every generation must choose what to do with that knowledge. Some choose to leave. Some choose to stay and tend the memory. But none choose to forget. Because Martha Whitmore, in her terrible wisdom, made forgetting biologically impossible for those who lived it. And once you've felt history in your bones, once you've dreamed other people's deaths, once you've smelled the metallic tang of ancestral violence seeping from your own skin, you can't pretend ignorance. That was her gift. That was her curse. That was the milk of Black Hollow. And long after the last drop evaporated, long after the mycelial networks died and the bones turned to dust, the lesson remained. We are what we consume. We are where we live. We are the inheritors of every atrocity and every kindness that came before. And the only question worth asking is what we'll do with that inheritance. Black Hollow answered. The memorial stands. The names are remembered. The truth persists. And somewhere in the eastern hills, in a ravine that still occasionally yields fragments of bone after heavy rains, the land keeps its own counsel, waiting to see if the lessons learned will outlast the people who learned them. The milk is gone. The memory remains. And that, in the end, is exactly as it should be. Perpetuates cycles of violence instead of breaking them. The children of Black Hollow's children don't have the dreams anymore. The compounds have long since cleared from their bloodlines through natural metabolism and the passage of time. But they know the stories, learn them in the one-room schoolhouse that Sarah Graves founded, visit the memorial every year on October 31st to remember and understand in a way their great-great-grandparents never did. The ground beneath them isn't neutral territory, isn't just geology and geography. It's saturated with history, soaked through with the blood and bones and screaming of those who came before, those who were murdered so that white settlers could build comfortable lives on stolen land. Every generation since 1895 has had to choose what to do with that knowledge, with the weight of that terrible inheritance. Some choose to leave Black Hollow entirely, unable to reconcile living on ground they know is consecrated by violence. Others choose to stay and tend the memory actively, deliberately, ensuring that the names on the memorial are spoken aloud annually, that the history is taught without euphemism or comfortable lies, that the debt, though it can never be fully repaid, is at least acknowledged with clear eyes and honest tongues. Because Martha Whitmore, in her terrible wisdom accumulated over 48 years of solitary vigilance, made forgetting biologically impossible for one generation. And once you've felt history in your bones, once you've dreamed other people's deaths with such vividness that you wake screaming, once you've smelled the metallic tang of ancestral violence seeping from your own skin, once you've felt your skeleton trying to accommodate information from bones that aren't your own, you can't pretend ignorance. You can't claim you didn't know. You can't hide behind comfortable distance from events that happened before you were born. That was her gift to Black Hollow. That was her curse upon the descendants of murderers. That was the milk's true purpose. Not supernatural vengeance from beyond the grave, but biological memory transfer that made historical truth unavoidable, that forced acknowledgement through chemical incorporation, that demonstrated once and for all that we are quite literally built from the ground we stand on, composed of materials derived from all who came before, carrying their story in our very substance whether we want to or not. And long after the last drop of milk evaporated, long after the mycelial networks died and returned to ordinary soil bacteria, long after the bones turned to mineral traces indistinguishable from the rest of the valley's geology, the lesson remained, carved in stone and taught in schoolrooms, and whispered in the wind that moves through trees, still twisted from growing in soil, too rich with human calcium. We are what we consume. We are where we live. We are the inheritors of every atrocity and every kindness that came before us. And the only question worth asking, the only question that matters in the end, is what we will do with that inheritance. Whether we'll choose to remember consciously or force ourselves to forget. Whether we'll acknowledge debts that can never be fully repaid or pretend they don't exist. Whether we'll let history transform us or simply repeat it under new names with different justifications but the same fundamental violence. Black Hollow chose remembrance. The milk stopped flowing, but the memory remains, and that in the end is exactly as it should be, uncomfortable, permanent, unavoidable, and absolutely necessary. The memorial stone stands, the names persist, the truth endures. And somewhere in the eastern hills, in a ravine that still occasionally yields fragments of bone after heavy rains wash away enough soil, the land keeps its own counsel, waiting patiently to see if the lessons learned will outlast the people who learned them, waiting to see if one generation's hard-won wisdom can be successfully transmitted to the next without requiring them to drink the dead to understand what their ancestors did. The milk is gone. The memory remains. And that is both Black Hollow's curse and its only hope for redemption. Now I don't have good news. I love to produce these videos, but create them. It takes me a lot of time, and the only way I have to continue is to reach 1,000 subscribers, because this way I start receiving from YouTube. If you like our stories, do not let this channel die. Sign up and share our videos, since I am grateful.